Please open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. This morning we're going to be spending some time talking about the life of Lot. Just doing a basic character study of Lot throughout his life, what the Bible tells us about him. But before that, I want to say I appreciated Mike reading 2 Peter chapter 2 for me as a way of introducing this character to us. How would you describe the life of Lot? For those of you who are familiar with this story, you know basically what it's about, who he is. He's Abraham's nephew, where his life led and how he ended up. You know, what would you say about the life of Lot? Some of you may know I'm dating a girl who goes to college down in Florida. And last year she joined a book club, and together they were reading through the ancient Greek plays. Some of the epics like the Iliad or the Odyssey, and some other smaller ones. Ancient Greek plays are sorted into like roughly 3 categories. You have the epics, which tell of great, characters and heroes like Odysseus and Achilles, I guess, Agamemnon. Those epics, and then you have comedies, which are, of course, lighthearted kind of plays, and then you have tragedies. And the Greeks loved their tragedies. If I were to describe the life of Lot, I would describe it as a tragedy. It isn't a happy story. And a little foreshadowing here. It doesn't end all bright and cheery, warm and fuzzy. That is not the end of the story of Lot. That said, there are a lot of different opinions about Lot as to whether he's like a good guy or not. Some people speak and think very harshly about Lot. Something important to keep in mind, though, and something we're going to reference later on. How does Peter refer to Lot in 2 Peter chapter 2? Peter calls Lot righteous. He says, righteous Lot. God delivered him from the wicked people around him. So no matter what you say about Lot, you can't call him unrighteous. Lot was righteous. Now the reason we're so critical about Bible characters, and I think the reason why people want to call Lot unrighteous, is because that's how we learn from Bible characters, isn't it? It's easier for us to learn from them if we can sort them into a category of good or bad. If it's a good character, then we're supposed to imitate them. We're supposed to mimic the choices that they made, the people that they were, generally. I mean, you have like Abraham. We're supposed to mimic Abraham in the way that he set out. Not everything that he did, like lying. That was bad. But if we have a bad character, then we get the moral of that story, right? Don't be like that person. But with Lot, it's more tricky. It's not black and white like that. We have a righteous character, so we want to say, be like him. But as we look at the decisions that he makes, it's going to be pretty apparent to us that it is possible, Lot proves to us, it is possible to be righteous, but make horrible decisions that damage and impact the people around you that you love. It is possible to be righteous, but also make boneheaded decisions. And we're going to try to avoid doing that. That's going to be the moral of the story. So as we get into Genesis chapter 11, there's basically three sections to the life of Lot. The first section of Lot's life is his early years, his birth, and basically as he grew up. The second section of Lot's life is going to be his life with Abraham and departure from Abraham. And then the third section of Lot's life is going to be his life and departure from Sodom. 3 chapters to the life of Lot. And Lot's story begins in chapter 11 at the end of a genealogy. We're going to pick up in verse 27. Verse 27 starts like this. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. But Haran died in the presence of his father Terah, in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was barren, and she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran, and they settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. A lot of what I'm going to say on this section is going to be just basically a little bit of spitballing as to maybe what Lot's life could have looked like during these early years. But we get this, right? Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran, in verse 27. Lot is the son of Haran, Terah's third. But Haran dies apparently at a very young age. It says he died in the presence of his father in Ur of the Chaldeans. All right, and that begs the question, what happened to Lot then? If his dad died, and we don't hear any mention of his mom, whether she was there or she wasn't, that's up to speculation. But I would imagine that Lot, he was either taken care of by Terah himself, Lot's grandfather, or he was taken care of by Abram. But in Lot's early years, he got used to traveling. He got used to traveling because Terah took his sons and his grandson Lot and Sarai, and they went from Ur of the Chaldeans, in verse 31, in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran, and they settled there. I don't know whether he named that place Haran in memory of his son or what. But they settle in Haran. It almost sounds like they were going toward Canaan, and they didn't quite make it. They were going that direction, but eventually they reached a place that was, good enough. And so they settled there. But think about this. Lot, as a kid, is used to traveling. And really what we're going to get at, living in tents. But eventually Terah dies, and God calls to Abraham in chapter 12, go forth from your country, from your relatives. We know this. This is God's basic call to Abram. Leave everything that you know and love. Leave it all and go to only I know where. Abram goes forth. Verse 4, he went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Lot went with him. So Lot and Abram seem to have this connection. In Hebrews chapter 13, the Hebrews writer commends Abram for leaving the land of his relatives, and going where, God told him to go, and not knowing exactly where that's going to end up. And specifically, what's pointed out as being admirable to Abram, about Abram, is the lifestyle that he led through his faith in God. He didn't live in a city. He didn't have a house. He lived in tents as he journeyed. That's not an easy thing to do, and I think sometimes we can undersell what that meant. Could you imagine every single day in the morning having to roll up your bed, having to spend a couple hours to take down your tents, pack everything up, and hit the road and walk all day, and then you get to where you're supposed to sleep at night, and you have to set it all back up, and then you have to sleep there, and then rinse and repeat the day after? That isn't a comfortable lifestyle. That's the one that Abram was called to. That's the one he lived through faith in God. Now, if that's spoken about Abram, I think we see something impressive about Lot. Lot was willing to follow Abram. And I think that's an admirable quality that we can see here. He sets out and he follows Abram. Then in verse 13, after a little while, it says, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him. They had a brief stay in Egypt because of a famine. But they go up to the Negev. Lot goes with him, and in verse 2, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and where Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, and the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great, and they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. So the idea here, I believe, is that Lot is also being blessed, along with Abram. God is dealing very generously and very kindly to Abram, and Abram is being blessed more. You get that sense as you read through, especially verse 1. But Lot is also being blessed. They have herds, they have property, they have people. So much so that they can't dwell together anymore. There's not enough room. There's not enough space. It says the Canaanite and the Perizzite are now dwelling in the land. That's emphasizing that it's a cramped situation. They can't just go anywhere they want. So Abram says to Lot in verse 8, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right, or if to the right, then I will go to the left." And this is a very generous offer by Abraham. He's willing to give Lot the first choice of wherever he wants to go, and where Lot goes, Abram will find somewhere else. So the question then is, where is Lot going to decide to go? What's his decision going to be? What is he going to prioritize? And how is that going to affect the way that he thinks about this? In verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward, and thus they separated from each other. And Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against the Lord. Lot lifts up his eyes and he sees. It's the exact same thing that's mentioned about Eve when she saw the fruit, that it was good, a delight to the eyes, desirable. It's well-watered everywhere. It's a beautiful country. Plenty of space. Lots of greenery. The flocks are going to love it here. They're going to grow fat. He makes a good financial decision. That's what he does. This is a decision that just makes sense. And he pays no attention to the fact of verse 13, as already we're getting a foreshadowing of what's going to happen. The men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Not only did he choose to live in that valley, he chose to live among the cities of that valley. He moved his tents as far as Sodom, it says. As far as Sodom. That wraps up the second chapter of Lot's life. And now the third chapter of his life and his departure from Sodom. In chapter 14, there are 5 kings: Bera, king of Sodom; Bersha, king of Gomorrah; Shinab, king of Admah; and Shemeber, king of Zeboim; and the king of Bela. 5 kings who rebel against 4. And among the kings who are rebelling, you will notice in verse 2 that there is Bera, king of Sodom, the city that Lot now lives in. Notice what it says. Well, we'll get there after this. They rebel, and so now there's war. There's conflict. They fight. It turns out that the kings who rebelled lose. And the other kings come in and they raid Sodom and they kidnap Lot, or they take him as their prisoner of war, their slave. And word comes to Abraham, and in the middle of all this, in verse 10, the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into tar pits. That'll be important later on. It says in verse 13, a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew about Lot being taken. And now Abram was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner. And these were allies with Abram. Do you notice the contrast here? You have Lot, who decides to live in Sodom. What does that decision bring him? It brings him and it ropes him into conflicts that are not even his. Strife and conflicts. And then you notice, as soon as the camera pans over to Abram in the oaks of Mamre, Abram has peace. Abram has friendship with the people that he's living around. Allies. So Abram hears about Lot, and he takes his trained men, and they go and they fight and they defeat these kings, and they bring back the goods and rescue Lot. And then we get this really interesting section in 17 through 24. In 17 it says, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh. That is the king's valley. If you remember, back in verse 10, that guy fell into a tar pit. And apparently he survived. because he's come out to meet Abram. And along with this king of Sodom is Melchizedek in verse 18, who also comes. It says, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. And he blesses Abram. Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tenth of all. You see this, and Melchizedek is a character that appears in only a couple verses, but the Hebrews writer will make the point that Melchizedek is a foreshadowing of Christ. Melchizedek has no genealogy before him. We're not recorded any time where Melchizedek dies. He seems to be eternal. He is a king and a priest. He's greater than Abraham because he blesses Abram. Melchizedek represents Christ. And I think there's this contrast with the king of Sodom, who comes to Abram after he's crawled out of a tar pit. And he wants to make a deal with Abram. Verse 21, the king of Sodom said to Abram, give the people to me and take the goods for yourself. Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear that you would say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, and let them take their share. I believe the king of Sodom represents the devil. I believe Abram is having to make a choice here. On one hand, he has Melchizedek, the king of peace. And on the other hand, he has the king of Sodom crawling out of a tar pit to make a deal. Give me souls. Give me the souls of the people. You can have everything else. And Abram makes the decision to accept the blessing from Melchizedek, the same one that we ought to make. But what's interesting about this, if my theory is true, is that now we have the king of Sodom representing the king of darkness himself, the devil, Satan, and Lot is choosing to live there. Flip over to chapter 19. We're about to read what happens to Sodom. You know, around 20 years has passed with Lot living in Sodom. Let that sink in. 20 years of living in Sodom. That's a long time. And by the time that we read about Lot in chapter 19, he's got a wife and he's got 2 daughters, whereas before this, it doesn't mention anything about him having a family. So maybe he only started a family when he was living in Sodom. But a lot of time's passed. And God sends angels down to look at Sodom. In verse 1 of chapter 19 says, the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed down with his face to the ground. Small pause there. Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. I suspect this is informing us that Lot had some kind of station of leadership in Sodom. This was a common thing in the Old Testament. And if you sat in the gates, then you were one of the prominent men of the city. You were weighing in on judgments and cases being made. One of the elders of the city. But he's sitting in the gate, and when Lot saw them, he bowed down with his face to the ground. Verse 2, he said, "Now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, however, "No, but we shall spend the night in the square." Yet he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them. And he baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, and all the people from every quarter. They called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out so that we may have relations with them." But Lot went out to meet them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand aside." Furthermore, they said, "This one came in as an alien, and already he is acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them." So they pressed hard against Lot and came near to breaking the door. But the men reached their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. This is one of the nastiest scenes in the Bible that we get told about. And this is just a situation that makes your skin crawl. You don't even know where to start. Lot takes these guys into his own home. Why? Why do you think? Well, Lot probably knew. Lot probably suspected that they would not be safe in the square. The people living in that city would not allow them to be safe in the square. He protects them. He does his best. When they come knocking on his door, do you notice? I think this is another admirable thing about Lot. Is he opens up the door, he goes out to meet them, and he shuts the door behind him. Now, that is a brave thing to do. I don't know if I'd be able to bring myself to do that. But he goes out to meet them. And he pleads for them not to act wickedly. And I think in that kind of a way, he is foreshadowing Jesus in that moment. A pleading voice of reason. And then we always talk about verse 8, him offering his daughters to these men instead of his guests. And whether that was right or wrong, I don't have a good answer for you. But I think what we're supposed to get out of it is that if verse 8 was the best thing that Lot could think to do and to say, then the decisions that he made to get to that point were wrong. He should never have found himself in the situation where he had to offer his daughters in the place of those guests, of those angels. A lot of times we find ourselves in situations where we can't decide. We're trying to decide between, horrible and awful. And we can't decide, which one do we pick? Understand the steps that you took that got you into the position of having to choose between bad and worse. If you are having to choose between bad and worse, then you've already messed up. So the angels rescue Lot. They bring him inside. They strike the men with blindness in verse 11. Even then, they're still trying to find the doorway. That doesn't give them any pause. In verse 12, the 2 men said to Lot, "Whom else have you here? A son-in-law and your sons and your daughters? Whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place. We're about to destroy this place because their outcry has become so great before the Lord, that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." And Lot went out, and he spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he hesitated. So the men seized his hand and the hand of his wife, the hands of his 2 daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him. And they brought him out and put him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains, or you will be swept away." Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Now behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Now behold, this town is near enough to flee to, and it is small. Please let me escape there. Is it not small, that my life may be saved?" And he said to him, "Behold, I grant you this request also, not to overthrow the town of which you have spoken. Hurry and escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." Therefore the name of the town was called Zoar. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. He overthrew those cities, and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. At this point, you have to understand the intensity of that moment, of that night. Lot is told, "Leave the city. Get out. It is about to be destroyed." If you don't leave, you are going to be swept away in the punishment of the city. Verse 15. And I never noticed this until I was preparing for this study, but in verse 16 it says, "But he hesitated." He was still tied to that city. 20 years is a long time to live in a single place. And after 20 years, you get to know the people there. And you get attached to people. And you get attached to the places and the things that you're used to. But it says the compassion of the Lord was upon him. And because of that, they took him by the hand and they made him get out. They told him to run. Even then, Lot says, "No, the mountains, I can't run there. Let me run to this town. It's near enough. Let me escape there, that my life may be saved." So they go there. Fire and brimstone rains on Sodom and Gomorrah. They're reduced to rubble. But in verse 26, "But his wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt." His wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And this is part of the tragedy of the story of Lot. Righteous Lot. In Luke chapter 17, Jesus says very simply a short statement that I think is haunting. Jesus says, "Remember Lot's wife." Remember Lot's wife, who looked back. God told them, don't look back. Lot's wife had grown so attached to that place. I don't think this was simple curiosity. look around and see the fireworks. I don't think it was just that. I don't think it was a simple mistake. There was something that was pulling her back to that city that she was attached to, that she wanted to see one last time. And that's what cost her her life. Now, at the end of this story, Lot is scared so much, he leaves that town, and he goes up to the mountains like the angels told him at first. And what happens there as they're staying in a cave is that his two daughters say to themselves, verse 31, the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old. There's not a man on the earth to come into us after the manner of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. On the following day, the firstborn said to the younger, "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. Yuck. What a mess. Out of the way that the hopeful note of how this whole story opened up, Lot leaving with Abram, Lot being blessed with Abram, you just have such high expectations and hopes for the way that this story is headed. And then you get to this. How do we get to this? Something as ugly as this. Daughters sleeping with their father. Now Lot has a son, and yeah, that son is also his grandson, I guess. How do you get there? How does that happen in a person's life? It happened because of all the decisions that were made in between then and now. Second Corinthians chapter 6. All of the decisions that were not sinful, but were unwise, that Lot made. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul is pleading with the Corinthians to put away the things that are tying them down and that are turning their hearts away from God. He says in verse 11, "Our mouth has spoken freely to you, O Corinthians. Our heart is opened wide. You are not restrained by us, but you are restrained in your own affections. Now in a like exchange, I speak as to children, open wide to us also. Do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What harmony has Christ with Belial? What has a believer in common with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, just as God said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God. They shall be my people. Therefore come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will welcome you. I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty." So much of a Christian's life is controlling the influences of your heart. Wonderful promises are given by God in verses 16 and in verses 18. God's going to dwell with you. He's going to walk with you. He's going to be your God. And you're going to be His person. He's going to be your dad. You're going to be His son. You're going to be his daughter. What amazing promises. Those promises are made on the condition of verse 17. Come out from their midst. Be separate. Don't just aim to be like everybody else, because you're not. Be holy as God is holy. And that is a constant work. It seems like every single week, I am finding things in my life that I am listening to, that I am watching, that I'm reading, that I have to be convicted of and to stop. There are so many things that I'll just have the thought, if Jesus was with me right now, and he was also listening to what I'm listening to, watching what I'm watching, I don't think Jesus would be putting up with this. What are you willingly surrounding yourself with, letting into your home? Are you being boneheaded like Lot, saying it won't affect me? And we get used to things, right? But in 2 Peter chapter 2, it says, Lot's righteous soul was tormented day after day by the wickedness of the people around him. Is your soul tormented by the wickedness in this world? I don't know. Is just witnessing it, hearing about it, seeing it, does that bother you? Does that make TV shows not fun anymore to watch? Does that make music not fun anymore to listen to if it's talking about something that's immoral, using words that you would never use? It should. Paul pleads with the Corinthians. You're not restrained by us. You are restrained in your own affections. The things that we grow to love, the things that we grow to like, that we form an attachment to, those are going to be the things that we look back at. Those are going to be the things that destroy us, like Lot's wife. And now, as a special encouragement to fathers and to men who, Lord willing, will be fathers, there is a special lesson in Lot that needs to be seen. Lot was righteous. It never says that his family was righteous. Lot escaped as a righteous man, relatively unaffected by the influence of Sodom. But the influence of Sodom got to his wife, and it got to his daughters, and it cost him his sons-in-law, his whole family. How would you feel as a man, as a father, if you built your faith and your family in such a way that on Judgment Day you were the only one in heaven? You survived. You were righteous. But the influences that you led in your home stole the hearts of your children and your wife. I hope that scares you silly. As a leader that God calls you to be, you need to understand the authority that you have been given in order to lead your family in God's ways. If Lot was here, what do you think he would say to you? If Lot had an opportunity to stand right where I am right now, to tell you, this is the moral of the story of my life, what kind of things do you think he would say? If he could look around at the culture and the world that we live in, what are some observations you think he'd have? It shouldn't escape our notice the way that Sodom was described, exceedingly wicked and sinners against God. Out of all of the sins that Sodom committed and were guilty of, what was the one sin that we have recorded for us? It was a sexual sin. We don't have time to get into why Sodom was the way it was, how it got there. The Bible does tell us, I think specifically in Romans 1. The fact of the matter is, a broken culture and a broken society is perverted in so many ways. And in the end, it comes down, and it's plainest to see in the sexual perversion of a society. And I encourage you to take a look around in the culture that you live in. What country do you think produces and consumes the most sexually immoral media? This country, the one we live in. Would you believe me if I told you that it was not even close? About 70% of men in the United States have admitted to viewing sexually immoral content within the last couple months. That's a staggering statistic. And those are people who are self-reporting. The basic age at which someone is exposed to that kind of thing is about 12 to 10. And I'm trying to speak to you guys as delicately as I can, in as pure a way as I can about this problem, but also as candidly as I can. Because this is something that we don't tend to talk about a lot from the pulpit or in Bible classes, because it's ugly. But it's something that is going on everywhere. Every single day. Pay attention. There are things in this culture that are reaching out to get you. Constant influences that we take as normal and don't even notice. And it's everywhere around us. But are we letting it into our life? Are we intentionally surrounding ourselves with it? If we are, how do we get rid of that? I tell you, you can't do it alone. You can't. That's the purpose of God's people. To help each other get back up. To encourage each other. Admonish each other. God has already put in a system to help you. That's what the church is. At the end of this lesson, I would like for the main thrust of it and the takeaway to be, don't be like Lot and live in Sodom. But the fact of the matter is, that isn't the way that the Holy Spirit puts it in 2 Peter chapter 2. The 2 Peter chapter 2 saying, yeah, we do live in Sodom. We live in a wicked world that is going to be judged. The question is, will you remain righteous like Lot? And Peter makes the point that God is able to save the righteous from a wicked world, no matter how few the righteous are and how many the wicked are. God is able to do that. He is powerful enough. If He can do that, then the promise is for you. Are you wicked? Are you going to be destroyed? Or are you with God? And if you're not with God, you can make that right now. We can help you. Or if your soul is convicted and you want the help of the brethren to root out sin and the influence of the world in your life, and maybe you just want to talk to someone about it to be encouraged, then the opportunity is right now. If you are convicted by this lesson, then please come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.